And we thought Jim would obviously be the best possible person to open the curtain on a new year. For everyone who follows him on Twitter, and if you don't, you really should. He's been telling the truth and being quite vocal on certain subjects over the last few months, which is important, because I feel there's a lot of obfuscation that's been going on at policy levels. So Jim's been shining a light on that, and we thought who better to crack us open. So Jim, I'm going to hand over, just in terms of quick housekeeping, if you could please pop yourselves on mute. That would be really helpful, because there's bad feedback. Somebody has actually had to leave their room because of a fire alarm, which takes away from my joke of there are no fire alarms, but if there is one in your place, please run. And if you've got any questions, by now you should be very familiar with Zoom. There is a chat channel. Danielle will get the questions going when Jim has finished his presentation. So without any further ado, Mr. Jim, over to you.
How long have I got? Remind me.
You've got 20-25 minutes, and then we'll do questions.
Good. Okay, good. Lovely to be here. Thanks for the invite. As ever, I hope everyone is well, surviving. There's a long way to go yet, even though the Quality Street are in Asda. It's, you know, it's going to be feels like it's a long time till Christmas. You might recall one of the things that I was kind of reflecting on earlier in the summer was the Kubler-Ross grief or change management, depending on your perspective curve. And one of the things that I thought was interesting about that was that where I mean, it's not a linear curve, right? But where people were and where sort of everybody else was. So I've had this sense that kind of gold command meetings inside universities have always been a bit further along, and then have automatically expected everybody else to be a bit further along. And one of the things that's definitely happened over the past couple of weeks is students have returned. And I think there's been shock on both sides, as lots of people have realised that despite their long, wordy, explanatory emails, students are much further back along the kind of roller coaster of emotion than everyone else. And I think that matters for two reasons. It matters both in terms of the comms people have been putting out, but also in terms of the actual decisions that people make to respond to where students have been, both individually and collectively. The other thing, obviously, I was doing fairly early on in the crisis, was saying if we're not careful here, folks, we're going to tumble our way into an equivalent of the Fire Festival. And if you've not seen, I'll say this again, if you've not seen the documentary on the Fire Festival on Netflix, you really should. There are some extraordinary similarities between the higher education sector, luxury positional goods, the way they're marketed and how it all panned out. And then lo and behold, one of the things that has happened is that we appear to have literally recreated the Fire Festival on a number of UK campuses in a way that is playing out really, I mean, viscerally badly on TikTok, Instagram, and so on. Perhaps more importantly, the mood music that the sector, for all sorts of reasons, decided to send out over the summer, partly because I think it thought this was true, and partly because I think it thought it was really important to try to shore up recruitment and to put off deferrals, was the central message that most universities and Universities UK put out, that was your university experience will look and feel a little different this term. And I guess that's true if last term your university experience consisted of eating sandwiches that you didn't like the look of whilst being trapped in a room for 8 weeks. Now, the reality, of course, is that for lots and lots of students, the university experience now looks and feels massively and significantly different. And, you know, I think there's all sorts of really interesting reasons for that I will come on to a little bit later. I did say at the start of the summer that I thought there were probably some reasons to be cheerful, that science was moving fast on understanding transmission, that there would be significant pressure from sectors like sport, the licensed trade and schools to find solutions and so on. And I think all of those things are true. And again, to some extent, helped to carry universities along in a kind of bubble of optimism with all sorts of other parts of the world to be convinced that it was wise to move students into towns and cities. But I also said that there were probably reasons to be miserable, which was a real prospect of a second peak. Social gatherings would be caught up in moral and scientific panics about the amplification of or generation of a second peak. The import of students to towns and cities was already framed as invasion, let alone now with a kind of COVID remix, and so on and so on. And in some ways, those reasons to be miserable should cause us to be just as miserable now as they did all the way back then. I also had these reflections on strategies that universities might use around COVID, including distancing, what I would call extreme distancing, where, you know, you're not just sort of avoiding someone in a corridor, you're preventing someone from going out at night. The way in which you might prevent migration, forms of civilian PPE, treatment, vaccination, and curfews. And the mix of the way in which those are panning out, I think, is principally interesting, because what I don't know is whether the crisis that we are in now, A, is real, and B, will last. Because if it is real and does last, the idea that we can go into next term with a version of the strategies that we've had this term is probably for the birds. Now, you will know that back in May, Boris Johnson, it was actually May, lots of people think it was later, but back in May, Boris Johnson effectively announced a slow relaxation of national measures and a conversion to what he called at the time WhackaMole. This idea that when you have a small outbreak, you attack it very closely, and that avoids a kind of national lockdown. I think it's probably fair to say that there are two big problems with a whack-a-mole strategy when you've got a massive increase in cases. One is that you end up with not enough whack for the mole, and you end up putting all of the whack capacity that you have under untold amounts of pressure. But then secondly, if you end up with different shaped and sized whack around the country, particularly for populations that do a lot of travelling, it becomes genuinely confusing. And guess what? One of the populations that does a lot of travelling around the UK is students. And I'll just give you an example of that. The law today says that you are allowed to self-isolate if you have COVID-19 with a relative. That's what the law says. That's the law that was passed a week last Saturday. Of course, the law wasn't drafted assuming that there would be significant numbers of people who would take up the opportunity as a result of that law to then move across the country to self-isolate with their mum and dad who, you know, might live in another part of the UK. If your parents, when you're a student, live in a local lockdown area or Northern Ireland or Scotland, that means the following. It means that if you don't have symptoms, you can't visit them because of the current rules about household visiting. But it means if you do have symptoms, you can visit them because you're allowed to self-isolate. And look, the chaos we're therefore in as a result of layer upon layer of whack-a-mole that hasn't been thought through and properly debated in Parliament can't last. And what do we know when you end up with much more simple traffic light style measures? They're likely to not take into account specialist populations like students. And that's why you end up in this weird debate we've ended up in over the past few weeks about Christmas. And it's why those debates are going to continue as the government in all four parts of the UK continue to try to simplify whack-a-mole back into what looks like a kind of national strategy. The other thing that's very interesting is that in the guidance that DfE released 3 weeks ago, it talks about these tiers. Many of you may have been involved in meetings which scenario plan these tiers, and all the tiers are really about the amount of face-to-face teaching that would get delivered. One of the extraordinary things is these tiers haven't really been talked about since or used, and that's because the problem isn't on campuses right now. There are reasonable concerns from trade unions that, face-to-face teaching is still a problem. But actually, the concerns don't concern campuses at all. They concern communities and residencies. And it looks like, to the extent to which scientists warned government that residencies would be a major issue, that wasn't taken into account, and therefore very few universities, in truth, have been genuinely ready for the press coverage and incidents and things that have happened over the past 3 or 4 weeks. Now, I just want to reflect on kind of 4 or 5 major issues that come off the back of that before I kind of, stop, take questions and have a conversation. First is, most of our assumptions and subsequent modelling as a country all really assumes that citizens are under a kind of control. And what I mean by that is often, putting my media studies degree hat on here, a kind of panopticon type of control where you're being watched by colleagues or you're being watched by authorities. So if you're at school, on some level or another, your behaviour is being monitored. If you're at work, ditto. If you're in a leisure or hospitality or a retail venue, and if you're retired or if you're ill, the risks of you breaking the rules and or the extent to which you are under a type of monitoring is significant. One of the things that is therefore very interesting about young people and late teenagers in particular, and very much about students that have left home, is the level of control and monitoring is almost completely absent. And in any other year, that's perfectly fine, although actually quite often isn't fine in individual instances, in individual cases where there are really serious welfare concerns around student mental health, in some cases student suicide, lots of moral panics and real panics about student conduct in relation to, you know, the kind of rites of passage that are associated with being a student in the UK. But most years that is seen as a manageable type of freedom that is kind of adorned on students when they happen to leave home to go to university. Clearly, that kind of freedom, which is essential to the brand of higher education and continued to be sold in a restricted form all summer, now poses a significant problem because, as I say, students either get to do one of two things. Either they follow the rules and they're very lonely in their room, or they don't follow the rules and they end up spreading and amplifying the virus. And it's not at all clear that either of those things are desirable. And every time we tell a student to do one of those things, to not do one of those things, the implication is they should do the other, and they bounce backwards and forwards between these really, really significant downsides. All of that then, when you combine with our understanding of higher education in the UK, becomes actually quite toxic. So, you know, we know, all of us know, that there are three types of undergraduate, and depending on where you all work, you will have a different mix of the three types. You will have commuter students who travel in every day. And, you know, the discussion around commuter students and the extent to which they may be literally ferrying the virus backwards and forwards from university campuses to their home every day is barely discussed in public policy terms. The traditional thing that everybody talks about, that Boris Johnson talks about, and for some reason everyone else talks about, you know, Scottish and Welsh government have both made this mistake in the past 2 weeks, is the Harry Potter boarder who sort of appears at the start of term and goes home at the end of term and maybe for a reading week. Nobody appears to have noticed that a huge number of proportion of students choose a university in their region and go home almost every weekend. So this daft debate about Christmas appears to have forgotten that. It's really bloody hard to get on a cross-country train after 3 o'clock on a Friday. And if any of you have tried to get on a cross-country train after 3 o'clock on a Friday, they're packed out with students. That's what's going on here. And no one appears to have noticed that, which I do find extraordinary. So when you combine that with this other issue, which is about a kind of loss of control and a freedom branding, you end up with a problem. But perhaps the biggest problem of all that I've been banging on about all summer that I don't think is fixed today is as follows. What that graph does is divide up stuff that is facilitated and programmed and stuff that students organise themselves. And then on the other axis, stuff that's teaching and learning and everything else that students do with their time. They shop, they meet, they drink, they socialise, and so on. The sector patted itself on the back because it had managed to convert 3 or 4 or 7 hours a week in box A to online. And quite rightly, that was a really difficult thing to do. But what I was trying to say to people at the time is that for students, that great conversion didn't feel like much at all, because they were probably staring at a screen during their contact hours anyway. So converting 4 hours of their week from being a physical experience to an online experience wasn't the big change. The big change for students was the loss of their social network, their displacement geographically, and so on. And the reality of today is as follows, which is I can't find a university in the country that has a vision for what students are going to do all week. Because if box A is only 4 hours or 5 hours or 2 hours or 6 hours, There's a hell of a lot of other hours to be spent in a tiny room on your own, or not being allowed to enter shops or bars or cafes. And if we don't know what they're going to do all week, they'll either be really lonely or they'll spread the virus, probably. You know, is there a way through those two poles? Nobody really knows. And where that gets us to is here. On the left-hand side, students follow the rules and you get isolation and mental health risk. On the right-hand side, students don't follow the rules, you get viral spread, timetabling chaos, bad PR. And it's not clear yet that there's a way through this for universities once we've decided to bring people to our towns and cities. There might be a way to squeeze through. It's not yet really clear. And I do think there's a way to improve the amount of space between those two things by giving students safe things to do. And for those people on the call today that haven't seen it, something very interesting I think happened last week in St Andrews University, who of course was basically first to open in the country. Sally Mapstone, the principal, announced that having spent 5 or 6 weeks telling students what they can't do, she was launching an initiative in conjunction with the Students' Association on safe things that students could do face-to-face, which I think is fascinating. They've gone through that curve of authoritarian curbs, realised they need to give students something to do all year, and have started to create that vision, and hopefully that vision will trickle its way around the country. Now, a few other things to say just before I stop. First, on testing. As people will know, right now, we only test those with symptoms. And, you know, there is a suspicion that we've failed as a country to go beyond that for at-risk populations because of a lack of capacity. And when I say country, I mean the whole of the UK. Fascinatingly, even the US is recommending that rest of households get tested when there's a positive case right now in the context of higher education. We are not going as far as the US, which gives you a sense of where we are as a country with this particular problem. Right now, the US is advocating some testing on arrival, which really matters for January. Some regular testing of all students, certainly testing high-risk subsettings like halls of residence of asymptomatic cases, and intensive tracing and testing of symptomatic cases. I don't think universities can afford that. I think there are some interesting pilots in places like Nottingham. It's pretty clear to me that the government has to step up. Will it step up? Who knows? And if it won't step up, are we wise to go into next term with broadly the same residential come to our towns and cities model that we've had this term? Second is the ongoing question of residencies, where it at least appears to be right now the centre of viral amplification and transmission. It's fairly clear to me that despite warnings from scientists, government policymakers didn't predict, model or plan residencies in anything like the sort of detail they did around campuses. And astonishingly, even today, let me give you this example. It's the Office for National Statistics, through a survey of the population, that tells us what the R number is, both in regions and in the country. And its data set doesn't include halls, and it doesn't appear to include HMOs that have been, new households in HMOs that have been formed over the past 2 months. That's where we are as a country on understanding where students are in relation to the pandemic. And so no wonder directors of public health are looking at their incidence rates going, well, I had no warning of this from the R number that was being supplied to me by government. That's the sort of chaos we are in right now. And the question remains, will the country put up with, if residencies continue to be a problem, bringing students together into large shared residencies next term, or will this fade out over the next 2 or 3 weeks? And then 2 more things. One is on refunds. If you've listened to the radio over the past week and listened to parents or students complaining on everything from You and Yours to Jeremy Vine to LBC to BBC Radio Nowhere, you will have heard parents and students complaining about having to fork out for all of these things that they're kind of not experiencing. Now, some people will remember this model of mine. I suspect that those wider benefits of higher education, particularly residential higher education, involving the forming of identity and social capital and wider experiences and, you know, going to see Buckingham Palace if you've come to London, all that sort of stuff. It's kind of tough luck. We are in the middle of a pandemic. And there's no doubt that if you look at that kind of white section at the bottom, almost all of the teaching and learning that has been promised to people has successfully transitioned online or is being delivered face to face. It's the purple bit that's the problem. It's the purple bit that the Competition and Markets Authority has argued in the context of nurseries, and in the context of holiday providers, and in the context of wedding arrangers. It's the purple bit that the Competition and Markets Authority has said you really ought to be giving people partial refunds. Whether or not CMA turns its attention to higher education, and if it does, what it will say, we don't yet know. But it's fairly clear, I think, that students aren't getting what they paid for in relation to facilities and services. And even though the costs are still there, it's likely that in time it will reveal itself that students have a pretty strong case for at least a partial refund. And then the very final thing I want to say is this. The sector is really pleased with itself, I think, because of the great online pivot that happened in March, April and May. And I think there's good reason to be proud of the amount of work that people have put in, the amount of graft that has happened over the summer to make all of that happen. And I really do hope a lot of it hasn't gone to waste. But it does seem to me that our binary models of either being a commuter or living in a city permanently are a little bit strange, and to some extent have led to both this problem in dealing with the pandemic and more general problems about ripping graduates out of towns like mine when I was a kid in Walsall, wider social bifurcation, and so on and so on. There are more interesting hybrid models around people coming together for intensive periods for 3 or 4 days a term. Students not having to literally be lifted out of where they live, and then, you know, being able to at least experience and make networks and friends with other people without having to rent a property for the entire year, that have echoes to these wider questions about hybrid models of either working from home or working in an office. And I do think there's a potential opportunity for clever and innovative people over the next year or so to start to develop more innovative models of higher education delivery that can get us out of this awful paradox of either having to be Harry Potter or Charlie Bucket stuck on the bus. And on that, I will stop.
Thanks, Jim. Do we have any questions in the room? I can't see. Are you able to unshare your or stop sharing your screen, Jim, and then if that's okay?
I don't know where my controls have gone. There we go. Yeah.
Perfect. Pete, do you want to ask your question if you want to unmute yourself?
I can do. It's a really upbeat, happy question, obviously. Thanks for that, Jim. Brilliant as ever. I'm speaking to quite a lot of unis, as I'm sure you are, and the thing I was worrying about early on was burnout, because everyone goes hell for leather until the summer, and then I'm not saying they have a holiday, but they have some downtime and they have a chance to create some mental space. No one's had that. How close to burnout do you think the people are that you're speaking with?
Oh God, I mean, blimey. It sort of depends on which theory you read, right? But I mean, it looks to me like people are in the throes of deep burnout and now just sort of operating and moving, and therefore making really obvious big mistakes. So the big story of the past 24 hours, I suspect, is a story not about Microsoft and its software. It's about burnout and people making daft decisions when they're on no capacity and they've done 50 hours a week and so on. And I think that, you know, making decisions when you're just operating on automatic, when it's day 100, you haven't had a day off, you know, your Zoom calls are lasting 13 hours a day and so on. That kind of quality of decision making is affecting every part of society at every level and is genuinely dangerous. I think not because I think higher education will stop or you will see a lot of sickness. The textbooks would tell us that we will see a lot of people potentially sick after Christmas who get really ill when they stop. You know, that thing about when you stop in the middle of this, that's when it really hits. I think the danger is that we end up making really poor decisions, or we fail to anticipate obvious things just at the point this term when we need to be absolutely on top of our game as a sector in relation to non-continuation. Because it seems to me that non-continuation is about to be the big issue. And I have been confounded in my predictions insofar as hardly anyone, in truth, is talking about it publicly, talking about the sort of strategies that we could use to, you know, deal with it, talking about the sorts of cushions that we should use where it's unavoidable, and so on and so on. So you know, even that stuff that's happened today with Universities UK releasing on, here we are, the 6th of October, you know, guidance on how to support students that are self-isolating, I suspect is a result of this kind of deep level of running on fumes, burnout, rather than, you know, something malicious or deliberately problematic.
Yep.
Thanks, both. Did anybody have a question? I have got one that somebody did provide beforehand, but if anybody in the room would like to ask one before I do that. No? One of the questions we had before was about students engaging online, and by doing that, what support needs do you think are likely to be missed?
Oh, well, look, there are, we've picked up effectively two schools of thought here. So one is, if students are spending most of their time and doing most of their interaction online, are there types of support that we need to put in place that are different, or ways of recreating the physical that, you know, can kind of work online? And I won't go into those into too much detail. You know, there are articles on the site, there are consultancies and people that have come up with, you know, interesting checklists and lists of things that if you were doing it face to face, you really ought to do online. I think the problem with all of that debate is it assumes that a particular component of the student experience, in this case, teaching, learning, and the support that goes around it, both can and should be converted to online, whilst simultaneously lifting people out of their communities and dropping them in a room, in a tiny room somewhere. And the problem with that, if you add it up in its totality, is, or everybody assumes that their bit can go down to 30% face-to-face capacity or 0% capacity. The problem is, from a student point of view, that adds up to something that's very, very oppressive and very, very punishing. And so I'm going to cheat in my answer to that question, because my answer isn't you should use the following software or run the following activity or deploy the following strategy. My answer is, we are not seeing, in my view, nearly enough day in the life of, week in the life of, through a student's eyes, understanding of what it's like to be a student in this environment right now. And the tabloid press and the broadsheets are putting the sector to shame in telling stories of students about what it's like to be a student across a whole week in this scenario. And my view is, anyone with an ounce of capacity ought to be trying to get there to understand what the whole week is like, in order to then work out what the correct solutions are next week and next term.
Thanks, Jim. I have got one other one. I'm just kind of, anybody putting their hands up or unmuting themselves. I just wondered if you could elaborate maybe on that interesting point of non-continuation, and kind of, when you see that coming, are there things that, you know, could be done? Is it kind of just going to be a likely outcome of 2020?
Yeah, well, look, there's a couple of things going on here, I think. So, will there be a group of students who would have stayed on had we have done a series of things this term, and therefore have we got time to do a series of things this term that might cause them to stay on? Probably, and I think a lot of that relates to what I would call horizontal support rather than vertical support. So I think most providers are getting round this week to realising, particularly for students in halls of residence, that they need to provide what I'd call vertical support. So support from universities, personal tutors, and so on and so on. It's the horizontal support that's always mattered, the feeling of belonging, the making friends, the having other people to bounce your questions off when you're writing an essay. That stuff really matters. And if we're not able to take steps between now and Christmas to find ways for students to safely meet people that are not in their particular household, we will be in trouble on that horizontal support. And all of the previous evidence would tell us that is going to lead to dropout. Now, the other thing I think is interesting here is, to the extent to which the realities of the pandemic and the difference between the expectations that students either reasonably or didn't reasonably have and the reality is causing a problem that might cause a student to want to drop out, there will be some things that we can do, some of which are morally fine, some of which are morally problematic and are probably similar to that moment where you try to cancel your Virgin broadband and you end up being talked out of it by, you know, someone in a win-back team in a call centre, and that wouldn't be helpful, I think, if students really do need to leave. And one of the problems with all of that is the lack of cushion for students who do leave. So we are entering the maximum period of danger here, by which I mean, let's imagine that technically in the contract, students have got until the end of day 14 before they incur a fee liability. There will probably be a family that takes their kids out of halls and out of the university on day 15, and the university will pretend it was day 14. Day 16 will be slightly harder to tolerate than day 14. And a week later, there will be a high profile moment where a student that's been significantly trapped, let down, had a miserable time, is told by their university they have now incurred their fee liability for that term. They've still got to pay their rent for the whole year because it's a nomination agreement piece of rent with a private accommodation provider, and they will be all over the news. If I was at university, I would be prepping up for working out what we say about that now. And if I was Universities UK, I'd be lobbying very hard on finding ways to provide a cushion for students to legitimately drop out. Because I can't think of anything worse from a mental health perspective than tricking and manipulating students into staying when this year, because of those restrictions, really isn't for them.
Thank you.
Wow, that's created an eerie silence.
Well, as always, Jim, you don't disappoint. And I think one of the things that we always get feedback after you speak is that sometimes people just want to hear the unvarnished truth. We're all spending a lot of time trying to, you know, create good messaging and, you know, kind of look for the sunshine. And sometimes in a closed setting, it's really helpful for everyone to get a bit of a kind of like kind of moment, because frankly, it's only through truth that we can make things better. So, so yes, eerie silence, but for all the good, for all the positive reasons, I think. If there's no further questions for Jim, then in our very cheesy, because although it's a new year, we haven't stopped with the cheese. If we could thank Jim with our jazz hands, that would be awesome. And thank you so much for joining us, and as always for you know, for telling us, you know, kind of what's. Thanks, Rosie, for really shedding some light on what is going on. I think I probably speak for everyone when I say that your commentary and Wonkhe's commentary over the last few months has been really helpful, and I think some others have maybe not been as public and as open as perhaps we would have all liked them to have been. But nonetheless, it is going to be a challenging year. But I remain the ever optimist. I think the sun will come back out. We will get this thing under control. You know, Trump is immune now, so it's all going to be fine. Yeah. In the spirit of listening to students, next week we're super excited. We're going to have some students actually presenting at the session. We've got some King's Money mentors who are going to be talking about their experiences, which we're really, really excited about. If you haven't signed up for it, there will be details in the newsletter. If there's anyone in particular you want to hear from, or any subject you particularly want us to cover, please do let us know. But thank you so much to Jim. Thanks to all of you. We're always here, obviously, to help as much as we can with anything else. Have a fabulous day. Look after yourselves, look after each other, and we will see you all very, very soon. Thanks so much, everyone, for coming. Thanks, Jim, as always.